Almost. Now I hear my voice. Hi, everybody. Richard Garriott with you again. I appreciate you coming back here to this sort of a master class, you might say, about intellectual property development. I appreciate you coming back for a second hour of me today. And I hope I have some things to share with you that I know many of you are game developers, many of you very accomplished in your own rights. But I hope that the unique journey that I've been on that has given me sort of the unique perspectives that I have on game development, hopefully these will be of interest to you too. For those of you who want to ever reach out to me, by the way, I'm pretty easy to reach on Twitter at Richard Garriott, through the game Shroud of the Avatar, so come look me up. I think most of you already know that I'm a video game developer, but you may not know that in addition to video games, I'm also an entrepreneur in extreme travel and exploration companies. In addition to building Origin, which I sold to EA, Destination Games, which I sold to NCSoft, and Portalarium that I operate now, I also have helped build companies to take people to Antarctica and the South Pole, down to the bottom of the sea to the Titanic. Helped start the X Prize that has created a space plane that has flown into space that Richard Branson is now commercializing as Virgin Galactic. A company called Zero G Corp that does parabolic flights. A company called Space Adventures, which takes people to the International Space Station, where I've also been myself. So I'm actually the first second-generation American astronaut, and I flew with the first second-generation Russian cosmonaut. But today I'm going to talk, as I said, about building intellectual property in video games, but specifically trying to build intellectual property to last the test of time. And the reason why I like to talk about intellectual property is that if you think about selling games, games generally sell for one of a handful of reasons. One reason a game might sell, and in fact very often sells, and in fact I think it's essential to a game, is to have an addictive game mechanic. And in addition to game mechanics, maybe we'll have a cutting-edge presentation. If you look at how first-person shooters compete with each other, it's almost entirely on who can create the best bells and whistles, who can take advantage of the Moore's Law increase in the quality of audio-visual presentation technology. That is a race that whoever wins that race will sell well. But if you come in second or third in that race, you may not sell well at all. And then there's the other category, which is having a really strong intellectual property. And I like that for a couple of reasons. One is that intellectual property has this value that transcends an individual game. One is that, frankly, I'm tired of racing the race for visual quality. I did that in my early days. But it's really hard to keep winning at that game, at that part of the race over and over again. And on the game mechanics, usually that's not very protectable. If you make a game that's Bejeweled-like, there's many variations on that theme. So it's very hard to protect a game mechanic. And so I think that intellectual property is one of your best offenses and defense in order to make games that sell. And if you listen to the Dean Takahashi and I chatting a few hours ago, you may have heard me mention that I think there are moments in time where it's easier to make intellectual property than other times. If you think about your options for intellectual property on a game, you can either build some from scratch, or you might consider licensing an existing intellectual property. And in my mind, if you are lucky enough to find yourself at a moment in time where there's a new platform or a new distribution model, then it's a good time to build fresh, unique intellectual property. When I started in the video game business back in the early 1980s, there were no other role-playing games. And so it was very easy for not only Ultima to start, but Wizardry and Might and Magic and Bard's Tale. But after you already have quite a few to be noticed, people then switched to licensing existing properties. So Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons and other existing properties were used as the way to get yourself seen in the market. But the problem with licensing is you don't own the property. And so it might work with one game, but your studio has not gained in value in the same way it will be if you get the opportunity, if you find the opportunity to build unique intellectual property. And at least for me, I sort of look at, I'm going to kind of break down a lot of my thoughts into kind of three main eras of gaming. At least this is again seen from the PC-focused journey that I've been on. But there's sort of the solo player era, the massively multiplayer era, and the era that I believe that I'm at least championing now myself, which I often refer to now as selectively multiplayer. And for each era, I've sort of had a game type that went with it. The numeraled Ultimas, there were solo player, Ultima Online, and its add-ins, obviously, for massively multiplayer, and Shroud of the Avatar that I hope is opening up a new era. And interestingly, for each of those, I've had to build a new company. And I don't think that's by accident. I actually think that each time I became part of a bigger company, those big companies are not good at exploiting new opportunities, new markets, new genres. And often it is a younger upstart organization that will do better at innovating, do better at capturing these new market segments. But if you go way back, so I'm gonna try to go through these fairly rapidly, but I'm gonna take you on a little Ultima journey to kind of see how the technology, first of all, changed and how that affected my game design principles, and then I'll kind of try to summarize with some nuggets. But I actually go back to in the early 1970s. I was working on electromechanical typewriters called teletypes, and I was writing programs on a machine with paper tape as the storage, or as the temporary storage, and or long-term storage, and the temporary storage was here in core memory. So literally little tiny ferrous rings that you would charge magnetically one way or another. So that is 32 bytes of memory, which is one Ultima graphics tile. And that's what it took an entire board to store that one tile. And this is an example of the teletype that I used. And if you look at the graphic output, I had to simulate it, but you can see the asterisks were walls, spaces were corridors, dollar signs were treasure chests. But it sort of looks like top-down tile graphics, which is what the middle Ultimas were kind of known for, was the style that really started in the 1970s. And the solo player game era was dominated by retail. You would go to a retail store, you'd buy the game for $50. They were very hard to install. They were very hard to play. There was no tutorials. You had to make your own notes. You had to draw your own maps. And so we were selling to a pretty hardcore, nerdy group of folks, much like yourselves, back here in these early days. And if you look at the Ultima series, you go from Ultima 1 through Ultima 9, you can see they're sort of markers as to how the technology has changed. You go from extremely simple, a small number of simple tiles to a much, much larger set of tiles, and eventually over into 3D graphics. And if you look at the hardware, the original Apple II was 1 megahertz machine, 16K of RAM, 8K for an image, so you can only fit about 8 images in memory. You can only fit about 10 images on the floppy disks. And the frame rate was obviously pretty limited. But I'm showing you these numbers because I want you to see how those numbers over the years have gone up in lockstep. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little later. But the one thing that this personal computer did have was the ability to draw graphics. And my mother was an artist. And so my mother sat down, and on this piece of paper, she showed me how an artist draws perspective. I worked out with my simple high school trigonometry how you might draw in perspective on screen, and thus was born a Gamelab. So this was my first commercial product that was doing in BASIC 3D graphics, arguably one of the first 3D role-playing games in existence. But even to draw a monster, I would have to draw it out on graph paper, hand do the coordinates, hand do the trigonometry. But if you look at it, it looks just exactly like it turned out, in the hallways as you walk down the dungeon. And as I said, that became my first commercial product. Then, with Ultima 1, I wanted to show outdoor graphics. And so to do that, again, don't forget, there's no paint tools. There's not even a mouse. There's no way to store an image at all. There's no tools to do that. So anything we're doing, we're building it from scratch. And so to draw this graphics, and let's see if my little laser pointer works here. I had to first figure out what I thought. This is water. This was grass. And so you had to first draw it on graph paper to determine, even pixels showed up one color, odd pixels showed up another color. I had to first start on graph paper. I then had to convert that into binary. I had to convert that into hexadecimal. I then had to poke the hexadecimal into memory. I then had to write code to copy that hexadecimal into the area of memory that was showing up on the screen. And then if it did or did not look like water or grass or mountains as I expected, I then had to say, well, where did I screw up? Was it which pixel I drew on the graph paper? Was it the binary? Was it the hex? Was it poking? Was it the code? And so literally to draw any image required an enormous amount of manual labor and unaided debugging. But if you got it right, when I was making this random green drop pattern for grass, the point was to not try to make too many stripes, show up, to make sure that all the dots were green and that it didn't have any obvious tiling to show up, which is a much harder problem than you might think if you haven't tried to do this before. And now I'm going to move more quickly through the rest of the Ultimas. Each Ultima had a machine that had about twice as much memory. The clock speeds eventually got better. We went from 5¼ inch floppies to 3.5 inch floppies to CD-ROMs. Ultima 2 became the first computer game in a box, also the first one with a cloth map. Had more tiles, so the detail begins to go up. Ultima 3 was my own company Origin's first product. You can begin to see now, by the time we get up here with Ultima 4, the different depths of water begin to have enough tiles to show a little more detail. Right about here is where the IBM PC came out, and it's a good marker to look at this machine speed, because instead of 1 megahertz, it's 10 megahertz, so it's 10 times faster. But a picture is almost 10 times as much memory, and it only has 10 times as much memory in it, and the floppy disk is only 10 times bigger. And so if you have 10 times the speed, but you have to move 10 times as much data, that's a zero-sum game, right? So from a developer standpoint, the problem has stayed just as hard as it always was. The graphics are better, but there's no extra speed left to do anything else in a profoundly better way. The visuals are getting better, but everything else remains just as hard as it always was. And that's not exactly true, but it's true enough that I believe it has kind of held back many aspects of game design that I'll talk about in a minute. Tiles get more plentiful. You get to the point where you begin to have real artists, working with real tools to draw, things that are more like real art. The user interface begins to improve. You actually get now to real perspective and occlusion. You get up to the point where you wouldn't even call these tiles anymore. They're really just sprites that are arranged in a grid pattern. And then you finally get over to, as you get into the middle 90s, we've now made up another power of 10 of speed. But if you look at that again, it's 10 times faster, 10 times as much memory, 10 times as big as hard drive space, et cetera, all the way down through there to where, again, it's still the zero-sum game to a large degree, with one key exception, and that is 3D graphics hardware. That was actually the biggest of all the changes that I've lived through. That's the first time we began to offload a huge amount of the problem that was sort of keeping us in the steady state and could begin to make things better. And so, but these early GPUs, of course, were pretty simple, but it still let us move out, or let me move out of the tile graphics world and begin to get into the 3D world. And I think, at least for me, we began to perceive the virtual realities that we believed we were crafting, quite a bit better. And so now let me talk about some of the lessons that came out of this early era. Which is as important as it was to try to be a leader technologically. I learned sort of the hard way in many cases, how that can be very fleeting. Even if you have written the best technology that anybody's ever written, I assure you next year there will be someone who's using a faster machine, or is just more skillful, or has just worked harder, and they will surpass you. And so that is a very difficult race to maintain. And I began through about the middle of that, about Ultima 4 is when I really started working on intellectual property. And I began to notice certain things about, I began to introduce things like virtues and kind of a moral compass and karma. I began to notice in my own games and competitors' games why I thought some of them were or were not successful based upon how iconic, how memorable their imagery was. I began to really reflect on, my inspirational backdrop of places like J.R.R. Tolkien that I mentioned with Dean earlier today, and how an author's knowledge of the world can and should be and is deeper than anything they ever put in the game, and saw how that helps the developer, or myself in that case, make something that feels real, feels relevant. And I began to notice the thing about when you're putting in things like virtue into a game, you're sort of treading really close to things people really believe closely. Like they might have a personal religious belief that you're either going to nestle up to or contradict or augment. And so how truthy, how true your fiction feels, I began to realize was something very important. And so let me talk about social relevance. So one of the things I felt began to work really well was, if you look at Ultimas 4, 5, 6, and 7, each of those for me, the story was a reaction to what I was seeing on the news, and often how people were reacting to role-playing games in general, how the critiques that were being offered about my craft. And so, Ultima 4 was sort of, when people were out, frankly, just saying role-playing games and computer games are bad for you and bad for your children. This was during a period of time when people were saying games like Dungeons and Dragons and my games were literally converting their children to devil worship. And so I was sort of standing up for, games can be good. The next one was sort of about how, at least in America, there were a lot of people like television evangelists who were getting caught for either being liars or cheaters or womanizers. And so Ultima 5, to me, was really a story about even people in the world around us who are claiming to be good and righteous often are doing it for their own gain, or in fact are lying to you. So you really shouldn't trust even the people who appear to be or claim to be good and virtuous. Ultima 6 is one of my favorites. It was a game about religious and ethnic tolerance. And then Ultima 7 was how really almost any power or any belief system, including the ones I was creating, could ultimately be hijacked and turned to evil if the wrong people, get a hold of leading those charges. And so, by the way, even that description I just gave maybe already be deeper than most people who have played the game might articulate. But feeling that depth myself is what framed the decisions I made through the stories I was telling. And so, and I felt it was a really important piece to hold true to while creating the game, and I think is felt by the players, or at least gave depth to the experience that players felt. Now let me show you my really great artwork. And this came up, when I think about iconic imagery, if I look at those, I would describe those as a 1950s rocket, flying saucer, a TIE fighter, maybe whatever the Star Wars planet destroyer is, and a little Millennium Falcon, drawing over there too. And what's interesting about those is they're not only can a non-artist like myself draw them, but if I just say the word TIE fighter to you, everybody knows what it is in their head. Nobody can sort of draw the simple shapes. And what's powerful about that is if you look at the two images on the bottom, you see the TIE fighter, and the one over next to it is from ship from Wing Commander 1. That's the Dralthi. And I remember it, both its shape and the name of it, because I remember the shape of it. But by the way, truly to this day, I cannot tell you the name or shape of any other Wing Commander ship, because they all became too complex for me to have a good image of it in my mind. And so I actually think there was something powerful about Wing Commander 1 that was actually lost in the later versions, and even for Star Citizen, which I think is going to be great, by the way. But, if I were to have Chris around and to give him feedback, I would tell him, you need to make sure that your iconography, the shapes of the things that you make, need to be more memorable, or I think it's an advantage to be memorable. Why not make it memorable so that people can grasp it in their mind and even relate it and share it with other people because of its simplicity. When you get over to things like the virtues, when I sat down and I was thinking, crafting the 8 virtues I used in Ultima was actually a very hard task. I did a ton of reading for it. I struggled with what the pantheon of virtues should be. When I eventually settled on truth and love and courage, and I combined those principles in, as I was discussing earlier over breakfast, I think those are like 3 bits, right? So you have honesty, compassion, valor. Justice is truth tempered by love. Justice, sacrifice, and honor. And spirituality, all the 3, and humility, none of the above. I created a system that, while it's clearly fiction, I made it up, but I worked hard to make it up. They really are a pretty good set of principles. There's nothing dastardly about it. There's nothing, mean-spirited about it, by all means. And the fact that I then made this symbology by which it could all add up to a simple whole, the reality in which we live is incredibly complicated. It's hard to put a box around, how should we govern the world, right? That's why we have political debates, and we can't constantly steer left and more right and more left and more right. It's because they're both reasonable debates to have, and reality is messy. So in a game, if you can simplify it and go, no, I know the world is really complex. The real world is complex. But here in this virtual world, it's simpler. It actually makes it feel more true than many aspects of the reality in which we live. And so, again, that's something I think I stumbled into, but I think it's an actual powerful truth, is that making something have, as the comedian Stephen Colbert would say, truthiness, giving something good truthiness is a big advantage when crafting a virtual reality. And so it's just another slide to kind of say the same things. Well, in fact, I'll add to it, that I would do it not only just with the 3 principles combined to make 8 virtues, but then I would have, there's the 3 evil shadow lords, and there's the 8 towns of virtue, and the 8 dungeons of the vices, and there's, there are 8 planets in the heavens, and 3 comets that might come through that were bad omens, and so all this sort of numerology began to resonate all through all the other design decisions I made, and it lets the player, instead of thinking things are arbitrary, it lets you kind of figure it out, and you can figure out the mathematics of it, and you can begin to see ahead of where you are now in the story. You can see where kind of the rhythm, what's to come, and you can begin to predict for yourself what might be around the next corner. And I think that gives agency to the player, or gives a sense of wisdom or understanding to the player that makes them feel knowledgeable and powerful and a master of this reality in a way that's harder to do in the real world because of the complexities of the real world. Then another one that I think I figured out down through the years, but only finally managed to do well, starting with Ultima 7, was making sure that your bad guys have agency in the game. My early games and a lot of role-playing games, the NPCs are sort of just waiting around for you to come do whatever it is you do. And you might be min-maxing your way to become powerful, and when you're powerful enough, you go kill the bad guy who's sort of waiting for you in the final level, right? You don't see the bad guy in the world running around doing evil. In fact, you all as players are often pillaging and plundering more than the bad guy ever did, as far as any villager would know. And so one of the things I figured out is you really need those bad guys to, if you convince a bad guy to turn and become a good guy and give you a clue or a piece of information, the bad guy should take retribution on that turncoat. If there is a town that has been, harmed by the bad guy, and so they harbor you and help you out, the bad guy should raise that town to the ground. And that will make you begin to really, know that bad guy is truly evil, but also that you will wonder what the right thing to do is. Do you want to risk endangering other people along your journey to hopefully ultimate conquest? Another topic was languages and history, where early on, I remember, as I mentioned here with Dean earlier today, the moment of revelation when I was reading The Lord of the Rings, and I realized that the runes on the map in the front of the book were real. They were readable. You could actually literally substitute letter for letter English and or symbols to English letters and read it. And so I began to do that in my games as well. And and I even took that over to magic systems. To me, one of the ways I separate a science fiction from a fantasy is a science fiction that usually stays true to the laws of physics, other than a couple of things they change, like we can do faster than light travel, or we have teleporters. But otherwise, there's no magic, except maybe with the Force now in Star Wars. But as a general rule, a science fiction lives within most of the laws of physics. And most fantasies don't. Most fantasies just have magic. But the problem with magic is that magic can solve anything, unless you give it restrictions and rules. And that's what most people don't do. They don't restrict and define the science of magic. And so I felt really compelled to do that. And so I began to do things like say that the reagents you use to make magic spells work use simple, logical, understandable reagents, chemicals to make them work. The words that you speak to invoke the magic is also simple, logical, memorable, repeatable words. And that gave it, again, that sense of truthiness. And so now, we're up to the second kind of grand era, which we'll call the massively multiplayer game. And at least when we launched Ultima Online, games were still largely sold at retail, but they had this additional subscription that would kick in. They were still very complex. In fact, I would say it got worse. Installing and operating Ultima Online was much harder than playing a solo player game, because you had to learn how to make accounts and put in credit card numbers, and you were dropped with even less instructions into even far more complex worlds. It was brutal, the initial existence of a player in an online setting. And despite that brutality of way more expensive, way harder to get running, way more complex to get started in, it is still way more compelling to be in. Ultima Online became the fastest selling PC game in Origin and EA history, and is often considered the first true massively multiplayer online role-playing game. It still operates to this day, even though it launched in 1997. And what's interesting about that is when we actually have been trying to do it for many years before that. We actually had this pet name called Multima, Multiplayer Ultima, that we, even internally, we passed on starting, because until the internet arrived, we felt it was going to be too expensive to support an Ultima-like audio-visual experience through the slow dial-up services that existed. But then once the internet was coming online, we knew now was the time. But what was funny, though, is that, like most of my favorite games of the past, no one believed in Ultima Online when we decided to push it. EA's sales projections for Ultima Online were only 30,000 units lifetime. And that's not enough units of sales to justify investing in any AAA game. And so it was honestly very hard to get started. But that's another story to describe, trying to convince, EA to let us finally get Ultima Online going. But then finally when we did, as I mentioned, it became the fastest selling PC game we'd ever made. And that was despite the fact that it was already using graphics. Ultima Online launched in '97. We literally lifted the main graphics out of Ultima 5 or 6, I guess it was, from 1990. And to me, one of the main things about it was not just that it's massively multiplayer, but the thing that was still to this day unique about Ultima Online, and I hope we're reviving with Shroud of the Avatar, is that in most role-playing games, including most of my competitors' games, your life is almost exclusively, first and foremost, as a combatant. And if you do anything like crafting or other kinds of role-playing, that's secondary. You actually can't proceed in the game unless you're a combatant. You can't unlock the next piece of territory to go explore unless you level up in combat. And that was not true in Ultima Online. In Ultima Online, you could start and end your entire life as a blacksmith, or as a fisherman, or anything else you might imagine you wanted to be. And that's something I still believe in very strongly, and something I hope we're doing well with Shroud of the Avatar. Since EA, despite the success of UO, they didn't really want to do any other massively multiplayer games, so we split off, and the Wing Commander team went to Sony and did Star Wars Galaxies. The Ultima Online team split off. We did Tabula Rasa and helped bring on Guild Wars and City of Heroes and City of Villains for NCSoft. But I also, at this point, was now thinking about new design challenges, new intellectual property challenges. In particular, you know those, the runic letters that were on the Ultima maps? Those worked great if you spoke English. Because since it was just a letter-for-letter substitution, the word Buccaneer's Den was still Buccaneer's Den, but with the slightly different characters. But if you spoke, say, Japanese, it was a nightmare, because you had to convert it first from runic into English, then you had to get the word Buccaneer and go, what in the heck does the word Buccaneer mean? Because in Japan, I don't know what the word for pirate, might be in Japanese. And so it actually made it extremely hard for anyone that didn't speak either English or a Latin root language. And so I said, okay, now that we're selling games around the world, now that China and Korea and Japan are big markets, I don't want to do things that make the game hard for them. I wanted to make it equally easy, and it needs to be easy for people to read my cryptic languages no matter where they lived on Earth. And so I, again, started a research project. I looked into Egyptian hieroglyphics. Terrible idea. Ancient Chinese was somewhat pictographic, but not enough to really recognize easily. Thought signs, modern hobo signs. And then I found this thing called Bliss Symbolics. Bliss Symbolics is a language that was made to communicate with people who are handicapped. And so it was literally made for symbolic communication. And it was close, but actually I think they made mistakes even in their own language. I think the one I made is actually better for communicating to handicapped people than the professional product that I found to communicate with the handicapped. And so this is what I basically did. I basically sat down and said, okay, I need some pictograms that are agreed as a base. And I used to make these on Post-it notes, and I have them all over my office. I actually still have all these little slips of paper. And and I said, okay, if I'm going to make a text that maybe some advanced human-shaped alien came to Earth and left these symbols or left some messages behind, here's how it might appear. And they wouldn't know who would evolve eventually on Earth, so they'd have to make it some kind of universal language. And so I made a little person-shaped stick figure. I made a box was a thing. I figured an hourglass would be universal. No matter what planet you evolved on, some kind of sand hourglass is reasonable to assume it might exist, or at least you and I know what it means, so that's good enough for practicality. I used the concept of distance, kind of a road going to the horizon. And then I began to make variations on those symbols. And so obviously, man, woman, people, those are easy. But the reason I had these on slips of paper is sometimes I get into dead ends, and I throw away a base symbol and have to rebuild all the combinations. But what I found is, like, with that one distance symbol, even though it's a bit of a weird symbol, so that one you have to kind of learn. But once you've learned it, something nearby means it's over here. Something over far away means it's over there. One nearby is this. One far away is that. Two nearby are these. Two far away are those. And so I began to have these base symbols where you could pretty quickly create an entire communication set out of I tried to get to a smaller and smaller set of base symbols that were as self-evident as possible as to what the base symbol at least meant. And that let me get to this. So if I'm now looking at this, I'm not going to cheat and look to the right, but I don't read these very often. But this says, the leftmost column vertically says, long ago, our civilization grew upon a planet which was a far journey into the stars. And so, and once, by the way, you've heard me say that, you can probably figure out the rest of it on your own. And so I believe I've pretty successfully created a language that is at least equally easy to understand, whether you're speaking Japanese or Korean or Chinese or English or Spanish, whatever it might be. And so we began to fill all the art and architecture of the game with this actual language. So even though most people aren't going to bother learning how to read this, but I think it's appropriate that all the architecture in the game, it doesn't just have symbols on it, it has actual real messages from those supposed aliens all over all the artifacts that they've left in the world. And so you can, if you choose to, go read, and you get a much deeper experience if you bother to figure this all out. And that picture over there on the upper right is a picture of me on my launch to space, where actually I knew there would be a camera turned on during the launch process, and so on the back of that page, I put the secret message that I could flash to the camera for Tabula Rasa players that says, Earth was the cradle of life, but one cannot live in the cradle forever. Is kind of what that little message secret says there, which was a quote by a guy named Tsiolkovsky. And so then we get to another set of lessons that came out of the multiplayer era. Because those aren't quite IP focused, I'm going to skip over some of those. Of course, machines continue to get faster and faster, but again, other than 3D graphics, you'll see that all these Moore's law is happening on all aspects simultaneously. So again, we're seeing that same increase. And what's interesting too is you know, for a lot of you are younger at least than I am, and so you may not realize just how profound this change has been. You know, when you go back to, you know, the Apple II could do about, you know, 5,000 flops, 5,000 floating operations per second. And you look up to right now, you know, the graphics card in this laptop is doing, you know, 11.5 teraflops. You know, not megaflops, not gigaflops, but teraflops. I mean, it's an unbelievably larger amount. And if you look at the biggest computers, you know, we're into the, you know, hundreds of thousands of teraflops, which will pretty soon be in your phone. And literally in, you know, 10 years, you know, we'll have petaflops in your cell phone. And with that is also coming this amazing drop in the price, where, you know, you go back to, you know, when I was born, where it would have been, you know, something like $8 trillion per gigaflop, and you know, and you're up here till today, which, you know, like 5 cents. And so you know, it's just, and that trend is continuing to this day. So it's just shocking. But again, that goes back to this. I think the Doom and Quake series is a really good illustration for that race that I was mentioning of, can you make the best bells and whistles for a first-person shooter? And the trick about that is, you know, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember when the original Doom came out. Or excuse me, before that, Castle Wolfenstein, the Castle Wolfenstein 3D, which is sort of the predecessor to Doom. And you know, and at that moment, that was absolutely profound, state-of-the-art 3D, which was, you know, dwarfed immediately with hardware renderers, which was dwarfed immediately by the next and next and next generation, and continues to this day. And for those of you that can compete on that front, you know, more power to you and congratulations. But I think if you choose that, you better be young, you better be hungry, and you better work your ass off, because it's going to be very hard to remain in the lead on that front. And so now we're into the third area, and this is where I think I'm running out of time. I have just a couple minutes left. Is that correct? 5 minutes? Okay. And we're to this point where I call selectively multiplayer. You know, we're now at a stage where games spread virally very easy. They're very cheap to acquire. We're all playing globally with our friends around the globe. You know, people want to be able to play both synchronously online, but also asynchronously if they're not online. There's hundreds of millions of users around the world, and each of these upheavals, each of these market shifts that I've talked about, these three eras, you know, have taken less and less time to consolidate and given us less and less time to build new IP and build new companies. So it took like 20 years for solo players, you know, the 80s and 90s. Took the 2000s to sort out, or you know mid 2000s to mid 2010s to sort out MMOs. It's taken even shorter. Mobile and social games, even shorter. So all these things that we're doing, you know, when you see an opening, you need to move into it quickly. And now I'm going to roll over to the game I'm working on right now, Shroud of the Avatar, where one of the first things we wanted to do was really respect the social graph, really respect the fact that we are all have these very complex web of interconnections. And unlike Ultima Online, for example, where even though it was massively multiplayer, you still had to choose your server. And if you and I chose different servers to create our characters on, we likely would never see each other. And that's even if you're in the same country, much less if you're across the ocean. And so we really wanted to fix that with this, with Shroud of the Avatar. So, so we built technologies that are letting us build one single crafted reality. where the game throttles up and down from solo player to open massively multiplayer, both on its own and for you can dial it yourself as a player. We're developing it in a new way. We crowdfunded the game on Kickstarter originally, then on our own website. We're developing very much in the open. Our team's daily reports, weekly reports, monthly reports, and quarterly plans are published to our backers. We crowdsource a lot of materials. Almost all the music has come from players. Tons of tools have come from players. And we are diligent about releasing monthly episodes exactly on time. The last Thursday of the month at 10:30 a.m. Central Time, we release the next version, and we have for 43 months now, perfectly, on perfect perfect track record. Our servers have never had any software downtime. We actually had 2 hardware failures. This is the only time the service has gone online for a few minutes each time. And we even are doing this new business model. So it's not exactly free to play. You have to pay $40 to get in to play it. But then we also still upsell, vanity items and things like that. So we try not to sell power. And so we think of it as really sort of it's a new model again. It's a new model functionally. It's a little bit old school with new solutions to some of the UI problems of the past. And we're doing a new kind of business model around it. But we think that hopefully is both true to my past and takes things into the future. A little fun thing I like to point out here is in Shroud of the Avatar, there is a teletype. And if you walk up and run that teletype, it actually runs my first game that I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation. The game I wrote in 1974 runs on a machine in Shroud of the Avatar. And I used to call that game D&D 1, Dungeons & Dragons #1. Hopefully you guys will get a chance to come in and see, this is the Oracle, our primary mysterious character in Shroud of the Avatar. But my last thing to wrap up with is just sort of my advice to you as developers. First is research. I don't think you can do anything that's powerful and original unless you are willing to put in the sweat equity of research. And I don't mean go play your competitors' games. I mean do deep research in fields that are not games. I think you have to have terminology that's memorable and understandable and not hard to pronounce. That numerology, make things have good truthiness. They add up better even than normal reality. Use lots of symbols that people can wrap their head around, like the Ankhs that I did, or the Codex of Ultimate Wisdom, the circles and lines and things that I've had. Talk about social issues, modern contemporary social problems that you see happening around you right now. Whatever it is that's bugging you in the world, that's a good thing to use as the basis of a story for the game. And then, of course, think about the culture, the language, and the history of the world that you're creating, and make your IP resonate with that deeply. So anyway, that's me. That's my games. If you haven't yet checked out Shroud of the Avatar, I got to put in a pitch for that. And we're actually raising money now on a place called Seed Invest. You can actually not just back it and give money away to us as the normal crowdfunding, but now you can actually be an investor in these days with equity crowdfunding. For those of you doing games, by the way, check out equity crowdfunding. One good, we did our due diligence, and we happen to really like Seed Invest. So that's a place, even if you're not there to look at what I'm doing, perhaps for your own work, that's a good place to check out. seedinvest.com/portalarium if you want to check out my game. So thank you very much.